we could talk about some of these ideas as well. The first thing to keep in mind is that the natural state of human beings is poverty. That is, we are not born into wealth. Next one. Rand likes to make the point that life has to be sustained, wealth has to be created, human beings have to exert effort. So if nothing was done around us and we came into the world, we wouldn't be wealthy, we'd be poor. We have to create wealth. This point about the creation of wealth is, I would say, the central point of the book. This is what the book's about, that wealth must be created. And that leads to a number of other conclusions that she wants to draw about free markets and so forth. But this is still the central point. Human beings are not born into wealth. They have to create it by their own effort. And of course, that's what I'm saying here, is that it has to be created. Creation for Rand requires thought, so I picked this little quote out. The action required to sustain human life is primarily intellectual. Everything man needs has to be discovered by his mind and produced by his efforts. So Rand thinks that the tool by which we create wealth is essentially mental, that is essentially intellectual, that is essentially something that the mind has to do to think through. That again, if we found ourselves dropped on the earth in the middle of something, we would have to figure out what to do. We're not animals, we're not programmed by our ecosystem to behave in certain ways that sustain our lives. We actually have to think about it. The other point she wants to make is that thought is something that's done by individuals. We can cooperate, we can learn from others, but essentially thought is something that you do in your head and I do in my head, and we can exchange information, we can cooperate, we can act together, but still thinking is essentially individual. And this sort of individualism is what is also part of the essence of this book. Now, there is one question that she raises sort of tacitly throughout the book, and that question might be put this way: who is it that owns your life? Okay. We're born into families, we're born into societies. I'm just going to ask this question without answering it so much, as to say, well, what sort of claim is that upon us, upon each of us? What, if any, claims can a government make upon each of us? Okay. Who owns your life? When is force appropriate? When can you use force by one individual against another? Rand basically sort of answers the question, well, the person that owns your life is you, and that force is essentially an inappropriate way for human beings to deal with each other. I'm calling this the sort of non-aggression axiom. This is because of the libertarian movement, at least in the US, the non-aggression axiom was one of the terms given to it. It's not actually a phrase of Rand's, but still seems to apply. And the basic principle here is to never initiate the use of physical force against another human being. That's sort of the non-aggression axiom. Now, you can respond to force with force, okay, but you can't initiate force. You're going to have to deal with people on some other basis than force, and that's going to be persuasion, exchange, etc. Okay? But the initiation of force is what the non-aggression axiom says, and that's essentially what Rand is arguing. Fraud, of course, I want to say, is a form of physical force, so it is ruled out by the non-aggression axiom as well. This is a quote from Rand. She says, "Is man free? Capitalism is the only system that answers yes," because in her view, capitalism is the only system which abides by the non-aggression axiom, as we've just defined it. Now, you notice, it's what I said before, this is not an economic definition of capitalism. Okay? We haven't said anything about economics. We haven't said anything about whether it produces more goods than any other system or anything like that. You find very few arguments along those lines from Rand. Most of it is in the way I suggested here. Okay, so I'm taking my title, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and I'm going to focus on a couple of terms. First, starting with the term unknown. seems a silly thing to say. Doesn't everybody know what capitalism is? It seems to be pervasive enough, so it seems to be talked about enough. So I want to give a few ways in which maybe it's not so well known. If you take the non-aggression axiom as your basic principle and you want to talk about capitalism in those terms, very few societies have been capitalistic. In that sense, it is unknown, right? Because most societies have used force, initiated force, some individuals upon another for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes the reasons are not good ones. Sometimes they claim to be in the interest of the people. But if we think of capitalism as essentially a system of pure exchange, pure freedom, then there have been very few, if any, societies that have lived up to that form. So in that sense, it's unknown. I want to say that capitalism, at least especially as she uses it, and as I would use it as well, is not just sort of commercial activity per se, but the idea that the primary purpose of government is the protection of well-defined property rights under the rule of law. That is, I guess, an institutional way of talking about the non-aggression axiom, okay, the same sort of point. But we tend to say that capitalism is equivalent to commercial activity, and I think there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they're not exactly identical. Commercial activity exists probably in almost all societies, even some that are not capitalistic. What makes it capitalistic is, some relationship to the non-aggression axiom or some level of government trying to secure property rights and operate under the rule of law. The problem we have, of course, with this notion of capitalism is the problem of predatory governments. This is the main one. That's what I'm calling predatory governments. And Rand says in a capitalist society, all human relationships are voluntary. People deal with one another by means of reason, that is, by means of discussion, persuasion, and contractual agreement. Okay, well, that's the same thing that I just basically said about the non-aggression axiom. This is what she means by capitalism. Okay, again, not commercial activity, not wealth per se, but this is the essence for her of what capitalism is about. If you have this, she would argue further, you can get wealth, you can get the other things that people want to talk about, but this is the central core of her understanding of what capitalism is. Just continuing with the same point. What exactly is unknown? I think I've said some of these things. The main one is she wants to argue that it's the ethical character of capitalism that is unknown. Okay, people always want to defend capitalism in terms of the goods it provides to people. Okay, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that somehow misses the point. Okay, that she's trying to emphasize, which is that capitalism is, in some sense, an ethical system. It's based upon an ethical truth about the way people should deal with each other and about, in fact, how they should treat themselves. And so that's her claim about what's really been unknown about capitalism, that if you only focus upon its effects or its products, you're going to miss the main point, and in the end, you probably won't end up defending capitalism all that well anyway. Okay, well, capitalism is often connected with self-interest. I told you she has a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. She talks a lot about defending selfishness and so forth. We can talk about that as well. I think for me, the one thing I want to emphasize with you, and this is more me talking now than her, is that she draws a very strong distinction between being self-centered and being self-interested. Okay? Self-centeredness is not a good thing. Self-interestedness, or what she sometimes calls selfishness, is. And what's the difference? Well, a self-interested person can have interests in others, can have a broad scope, can have a wide view of life, can want to go out and expand and be better. A self-centered person sort of wants the world to center around him or her, right? And that's not what she's